Hello, welcome back to the History Sphere. What you're about to hear is part 34 in my ongoing series on the decline and fall of the Soviet Union. As I say at the start of every episode, I try to present each chapter in this story in such a way that it will stand on its own, meaning you can listen to it and get something out of it without having to go back and listen to all 33 previous episodes. That said, each episode is still part of a larger whole, and the pieces do fit together even better with full context. So if you're the sort of person that loves context and details as much as I do, those earlier episodes are available to go back and listen to, absolutely free, in the same place you found this one. Last time, on the History Sphere, I concluded my 2-episode narrative of the 1986 Chernobyl nuclear accident and the bungled response of the Soviet government to the disaster. This time, I will discuss material conditions in the USSR in the late 1980s as the economic reforms of Perestroika were finally kicked into high gear. This is The End of History, Part 34. Most of you have probably heard the term Rust Belt used to refer to America's declining industrial Midwest. Coined in the 1980s, the term generally refers to industrial cities around the Great Lakes in the U.S. Midwest that were at the heart of the industrial boom during and after the Second World War that propelled the United States to unprecedented heights as an economic superpower. Cities like Detroit, Cleveland, Buffalo, Pittsburgh, and many others in the region. Over the last 50 years, this part of my country has experienced a significant decline in employment and subsequently overall economic output. I've talked in the past on this podcast about my own origins. I was born and raised in the Pacific Northwest U.S. state of Washington. Washington is not part of the Rust Belt. But there is an interesting and, I promise, relevant story as to how and why I was born in Washington. My dad was not originally from Washington, but he moved there in the 1980s from the city where he was born and raised, Detroit, Michigan. His family had lived in Detroit for generations, and at one point he even worked in an auto plant in Detroit. But he left in the 1980s, just one small part of a sizable migration away from Detroit as its manufacturing sector declined and the loss of tax revenue led to an inability of the local government to provide the services it once did, which led to further urban decay and economic decline. I am thoroughly a product of where I am from, the Pacific Northwest. But it's also fair to say I have roots in Detroit, and I do feel a familial as well as an emotional connection to that region, even though it is not home for me. I guess what I'm really saying is that if the Seahawks aren't able to win the Super Bowl this year, and as I record, I think they are currently in the process of being eliminated by tiebreakers, I hope that the Lions can. Detroit was not the only Rust Belt city to suffer this fate, but it was hit harder than most by the decline of American manufacturing, and has since become something of a poster child for the effects of urban decline and decay. The roots of that decline in America's manufacturing sector are deep and complicated. Manufacturing in the United States has actually been consistently declining as a portion of total GDP since reaching its peak in 1953. But that decline significantly accelerated beginning in 1973 as a result of the event known as the Arab oil embargo. To do that subject justice would require at least another episode, and I won't attempt to do that. Not right now, anyway. But in summary, in 1973, in response to the Yom Kippur War, in which Israel squared off against a coalition of neighboring Arab states, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries issued an embargo forbidding the export of oil to any country that had supported Israel's war effort, including and especially the United States. As a result of this embargo, the global price of crude oil shot up dramatically. This affected the global economy in a lot of ways, but one of the most important was that it resulted in skyrocketing prices of gasoline, petrol if you're outside North America, and even shortages. This in turn led to a sharp decline in the demand for the types of heavy, gas-guzzling cars that were being produced in Detroit and other American industrial centers at the time. This lack of demand for these cars led to a subsequent decline in production and, of course, the decline in the needed workforce for the factories. The embargo did eventually end, but the American auto industry never really recovered. It accelerated the process already underway of the American economy transitioning from an economic system centered on heavy manufacturing to one mainly centered on consumer products and the consumer industry. One of the advantages of capitalism, whether you love the system or not, is that the market is self-correcting. We may not always like the way the market corrects itself, as it generally has no regard for human factors like people's livelihood and health. But left to its own devices, it will correct itself. And as demand for heavy manufactured goods like automobiles declined, the market stepped in and filled the gap left behind with what was actually in public demand: consumer products and services. So the overall GDP of the United States never really suffered all that much. The generation of wealth just shifted to other industries in other sectors. The 1980s, for example, saw the beginning of the tech boom. So as Rust Belt cities like Detroit and Buffalo declined, Tech Belt cities like Seattle and San Francisco simultaneously grew and thrived. It of course took some time before it became clear that this shift was underway, and at the time it very much appeared to many people, especially those living within the communist world, the USSR and its allies, that this decline in the manufacturing sector was a sign of capitalism collapsing in on itself, proof in their eyes of the superiority of the socialist model. The Arab oil embargo, of course, had a significant impact on the Soviet Union as well, though that impact was quite different from the one it had on the United States and other Western countries, as the USSR was not one of the countries embargoed. Despite being insulated in their planned economy, the Soviet Union and its Eastern Bloc allies were still affected by trends in the global market, and they did see an uptick in the cost of energy, which put strain on their economic engines. The Soviet Union, however, had an ace up their sleeve: massive reserves of crude oil, a commodity that was now suddenly way more valuable in the global market. The USSR had always produced large amounts of petroleum in the Caucasus, in relatively well-developed industrial centers like Baku and modern Azerbaijan. But in the 1970s, there were still massive untapped reserves in the forests and tundra of Siberia. Soviet economic planners had long been aware of the existence of these Siberian oil reserves, but most of them were located in such remote regions that the cost of developing them and transporting the oil from them was prohibitive compared to any benefit that might have been gained by actually exploiting them. That changed in the 1970s as oil prices skyrocketed, making it finally cost-effective to develop and exploit the oil supply of Siberia. The Brezhnev era saw huge investment in extracting and exporting crude oil. The development of this industry was so rapid and so effective that by 1980, the Soviet Union was the world's leading producer of crude oil. This had a number of benefits. I discussed many of the underlying issues with the Soviet economy of the Brezhnev era back in episode 21 when I discussed quote-unquote advanced socialism. For a more detailed look at that, I refer you back to that episode. But to put it briefly for our purposes, the centrally planned Soviet economy was very good at directing resources to produce large quantities of heavy manufactured goods, but was completely ineffective at anticipating and meeting the demands of the market. Basically, they produced a lot of machines and other goods, but had a hard time getting them where they needed to go to actually benefit the economy. Soviet journalist and member of the Communist Party Central Committee, Otto Latsis, explained this phenomenon like this. Quote, "They build irrigation channels which bring no increase in agricultural production. They produce machine tools for which there are no operators, tractors for which there are no drivers, and threshing machines which they know will not work. Further, millions of people supply these superfluous products with electricity, ore, oil, and coal. In return, they receive their wages like everyone else, and take them to shops. There, however, they find no goods to buy, because their work has not produced any. End quote. Latsis made this statement in 1988, after the economic crisis faced by the Soviet Union had become clear. But the problem was present long before then. The difference in the 1970s as opposed to the 1980s was that the dysfunction of the planned economy was masked by cheap energy costs and large amounts of foreign oil money injected into the state treasury. The government was able to use this money to offset the dysfunction of the economy by importing goods to meet basic needs of consumers where the domestic industries failed to do so, and by heavily subsidizing the cost of other basic needs like electricity and heat. This abruptly changed in 1983 when the price of crude oil suddenly plummeted. It had recovered by 1985, but then suddenly plummeted again in 1986, just as the Soviet people were still reeling from the Chernobyl disaster and the trust of the general public in their government was at an all-time low. The Soviet government was simply not prepared to deal with this sudden loss of state revenue, which meant they were no longer able to easily subsidize the basic needs of citizens. Rather than institute any kind of austerity measures to cut back public services, the government simply went into massive amounts of debt to keep covering the cost. They might have been able to sustain more of these costs had they not been bogged down in a military quagmire in Afghanistan and the massive military expenditures necessary to keep pace in the ongoing Cold War. But alas, despite his best efforts, by the beginning of 1987, Mikhail Gorbachev had been unable to extract the Soviet Union from either of these situations. The only way they could sustain these costs was by running up huge budget deficits. And as oil prices failed to come back up, they did not have the revenue to pay down their debt. So the only solution was to print large quantities of money, which in turn resulted in a spike in inflation, meaning consumer goods became even more expensive, and ordinary people's savings less valuable. At this point in a capitalist economy, the market would self-correct, and the cost of consumer goods would go up, resulting in less demand for the goods until the price came down and stabilized at a sustainable market rate. But since prices, especially of necessities like food, were strictly fixed by the USSR's central economic planners, and because these planners were unwilling to raise the prices for necessities, what resulted instead were shortages. Shortages of food and shortages of fuel to provide heat through the winter, among other basic goods. By the start of 1987, the crisis was so deep that it was clear to everybody, especially those at the top, that reform was needed to save the economy. And so began the second phase of Gorbachev's restructuring, or Perestroika. The first phase of Perestroika, from 1985 to 1986, had focused on very moderate reforms. Rather than altering the fundamental structure of the economy or society, Gorbachev had focused his efforts on attempting to eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse from the existing system, following in the footsteps of his mentor, Yuri Andropov. He cracked down on corruption and enforced employee discipline while changing the rhetoric of the government around foreign policy and political freedoms. But at that time, at least, he did not really step radically outside the shadow of his predecessors as general secretary. Now, with the deepening of the crisis, it was time for him to truly reform the society. There are basically two schools of thought about Gorbachev. The first is that when he assumed the office of general secretary, he really wasn't radically different from his predecessors, and it was only as he became aware of the depth of the crisis that he faced that he embraced the need for more radical solutions. The other is that he embraced those more radical solutions from the start, but needed time to consolidate his position before he could really do the things he wanted to do. Those of you who have been listening to my podcast for a while can probably guess that my opinion lies firmly in the second camp. I think he was a radical from the start, and simply had to bide his time before he could accomplish the things he really wanted to do. But whatever his personal beliefs and motivations, it is clear that the reforms of 1987 were fundamentally different from those of 1985. Gorbachev himself wrote in his memoirs that there is a line that divides his life, and that line is the disaster at Chernobyl. Though he never said so in as many words, Multiple advisors close to Gorbachev expressed that after Chernobyl, he increasingly came to the realization that the existing Soviet system could not be saved, was not worth saving, and must be replaced. He remained committed to socialism and to preserving the Soviet Union as a unified political entity, but by 1987 he had concluded that in order for that union to survive, it must be entirely remade from top to bottom. To this end, he pursued radical reforms on two fronts, political and economic. He and his advisors got to work drafting new laws that could be introduced to the Supreme Soviet, which at this point was still just a rubber stamp for the Communist Party leadership, which could remake the economy without entirely abandoning the ideals of socialism. It is very important to understanding these economic reforms to know that the goal was not to abandon socialism and replace it with capitalism. Gorbachev and his closest advisors remained dedicated to the ideals of socialism. The point of the reforms was to introduce market-based reforms that would make socialism work. Various laws were passed to decentralize the planning of the economy, giving factory directors and other officials on the local level more autonomy to make decisions about production and distribution that were more in line with the reality of conditions on the ground. But they were still tied to the central directives of the State Planning Commission. One of the most important of these laws was the Law on Cooperatives, which was passed on June 8, 1988. Without fully privatizing the economy, this act did open up an alternative to the state-run economy where workers would be incentivized by the profit motive. Some of you are probably familiar with worker-owned cooperatives as a business model, as this is a business structure that, though it's more rare than other business structures like corporations or limited liability companies, does exist within Western capitalist economies. Basically, rather than having an owner or owners, the company is owned in common by all its members, each of whom owns a share, and if the company turns a profit, they will all share in the profits of that enterprise. It remained illegal for these private cooperatives to hire employees who would work for a wage. The thinking was that by ensuring that all of the workers shared equally in the profits of a private enterprise, there could be no exploitation and class division between the quote-unquote ownership or management and the workers. So in their ideal form, these cooperatives would reap all the benefits of private enterprise, spurred by the profit motive, while avoiding the exploitation that is inherent in a capitalist system. Of course, these cooperatives rarely, if ever, worked in such an ideal form. For one, relatively few people took advantage of this new opportunity, at least at first. Many Soviet citizens were apprehensive about joining or starting a cooperative because of the uncertainty that came with it. Why take the risk when you can continue working for a guaranteed wage with a state institution and continue to have the state provide for all your basic needs like housing? Even with the shortages, there was no famine, and most people were content with the guaranteed security that they already lived with, even if their standard of living was on the decline, rather than to risk everything on a venture that was by no means guaranteed to succeed. People were also apprehensive at this point about the permanency of the reforms. This was not the first time the state had pushed some kind of economic reform, and as often as not, once there was a change in leadership, the reforms would evaporate and go away. Some worried that they may leave their job to join a cooperative, and then 6 months later, Gorbachev would be ousted and Perestroika rolled back, suddenly leaving them unemployed and branded as capitalists by some new reactionary regime. Those who did make the leap and form cooperatives faced a number of challenges as well, which made their position appear unenviable to others who may have considered joining them in the private sector. They faced very high tax rates, which made it difficult to make a profit and discouraged participation. As with just about everything when we talk about modern Russian history, corruption was endemic within the system as well. Cooperatives were often victimized by various protection extortion rackets. To those who are unfamiliar, this is where a gangster or other criminal element forces a business to pay quote-unquote protection money to them so that the criminals will not brutalize them. And in return, the criminal organization collecting the protection money is expected to also prevent other criminals from causing trouble for the business. Now, you may ask why the cooperatives didn't simply report such elements to the authorities, but in communities across the USSR, the police and other local authorities were often running lucrative protection rackets of their own, or at the very least, taking payments from the criminals who were running the rackets. These extortion fees were often quite exorbitant, and in addition to the heavy burden of official taxes, a lot of businesses simply could not make enough money to pay these unofficial taxes and the official taxes that they owed while still turning a profit. Eventually, Gorbachev's economic advisors convinced the authorities to lighten the tax burden on cooperatives to further incentivize participation in the private sector, but they were able to do little to curb the endemic corruption that plagued it, because so many government and party officials were themselves profiting from it. There was also great social pressure against joining cooperatives, as these businesses were not generally well liked by the public. Goods produced and sold by the cooperatives were generally of higher quality than goods produced in state institutions. But because the cooperatives had to operate within the reality of market conditions, and state institutions did not, cooperative-made goods were usually significantly more expensive than goods produced in state factories. However, due to the aforementioned shortage of consumer goods produced by state institutions, people who wanted to purchase consumer goods like clothing, car parts, and even food often had no choice but to pay the higher prices charged by the cooperatives. Needless to say, many of them resented it. The term speculator, a relic of the Stalin era used to accuse people resisting collectivization of hoarding food from the people to make a profit, was thrown around pretty flippantly to describe these cooperatives. There was a widespread belief that the cooperatives were engaged in price gouging, and were the incarnation of the exploitative capitalists that Soviet propaganda had always warned them about. It also didn't help that many of the people who joined or formed cooperatives were simply people who had already been in business on the black market before the law on cooperatives was passed. When the private sector was legalized, they simply emerged from the shadows and continued doing what they had already been doing. Activity in the black market was widespread before this, and I talked at length about the importance of this quote-unquote second economy to the overall Soviet economy back in episode 21. So it's fair to say that most people understood the necessity for the private sector as a supplement to the state-run economy. But many of them did not like it, and those who engaged in it were often distrusted and socially ostracized. A decent analogy for my American listeners might be health insurance. Many of us don't like our health insurance companies and wish we had a better option, but most of us recognize the necessity of having health insurance and have it anyway. If you're listening from a country that has universal health care, I'm sorry, this metaphor is probably lost on you. For all these reasons and more, the law on cooperatives did not have nearly the impact on the economy that Gorbachev and his close advisors hoped it would. As the economic crisis deepened, Gorbachev increasingly found himself between a rock and a hard place politically, facing pressure and criticisms from both sides. Those like Premier Nikolai Ryzhkov and Second Party Secretary Yegor Ligachev, while publicly supportive of Perestroika, privately pushed back against the reforms for going too far, and wielded all of their influence to ensure that the reforms were not as radical as Gorbachev may have liked. Ligachev's criticism eventually became increasingly public, at least in party circles, and he would eventually challenge Gorbachev for the post of General Secretary at the Party Congress of 1990, framing himself as the Leninist candidate who would save the party from Gorbachev, the Social Democrat. On the other side, there were younger advisors like Boris Yeltsin, promoted and brought into the inner circle by Gorbachev himself, who were aggressively pushing him in the opposite direction, toward more radical economic reform. Yeltsin would eventually become an advocate not for reform, but for revolution, advocating for the immediate and complete privatization of the economy. In 1987, Yeltsin would resign his position on the Politburo. He was the first person in Soviet history to do so, out of frustration with the sluggishness of Perestroika and his inability to sway Gorbachev to his more radical point of view. In time, he would become Gorbachev's greatest political and personal rival. I had not initially planned to introduce Yeltsin until a later episode, and I'm not yet going to go into too much detail on him, but suffice to say that I will have a lot more to say about him as this story goes forward. He is one of the most pivotal characters in the endgame of our story, and I will probably devote an entire episode to him rather soon. For now, simply note that in the late 1980s, he emerged as the leader of the radical pro-reform opposition to Gorbachev, while Rizhkov and Ligachev emerged as leaders of the conservative opposition to Gorbachev. By attempting to take the middle way, Gorbachev ended up angering everybody and pleasing nobody. The other side of Perestroika at this time was glasnost, a Russian word meaning openness or transparency. To the best of my knowledge, in the Soviet context, the term was first used in 1965 as the rally slogan of a dissident demonstration on Pushkin Square in Moscow, demanding transparency around the criminal trials of two dissident writers who I mentioned briefly back in episode 22, Yuli Daniel and Andrei Sinyavsky, who were accused of circumventing Soviet censors to have prohibited works published in the West. At the time, the protest was crushed, the trial kept secret, and the defendants ultimately sentenced to 5 and 7 years of hard labor, respectively. But the term survived and became a slogan of various underground Soviet dissident movements in the 1970s and the early 1980s, a fact that Gorbachev was most certainly aware of when he first started using the term to describe his program of political reform in 1985. In 1985, Gorbachev used the term only in passing, without referencing it as an official state policy, to refer to the need to reinvigorate the Communist Party with debate and frank discussion to face the problems of their time. It was not really until after Chernobyl that the concept expanded to the broader society outside the party. Gorbachev saw the failure at Chernobyl not in the technical failure of the reactor, though that certainly happened, but in the way the government responded to the crisis, particularly in how it handled the dissemination of information. His thinking was that if the authorities had been honest and forthright about the disaster from the beginning, the consequences may have been not so bad, and the international image of the Soviet Union would not have suffered as much. I agree, by the way, as I said last time, the cover-up at Chernobyl was worse than the crime. Gorbachev understood that many Soviet people had lost a great deal of trust in the Soviet government and its institutions following the Chernobyl debacle, and his proposal to restore that trust was glasnost. That meant opening the government up to the public, allowing people and the press to question and even criticize the government, and to join in a public debate about the best way forward for the country. Initially meant as a measure for mere governmental transparency, as various journalists, academics, and dissidents challenged the boundaries of glasnost, they soon found that it had few. The authorities were as confused by the policies as the general public, and didn't know whether to censor or punish more radical conduct, often taking the traditional Soviet step of doing nothing until explicitly told otherwise. And the word just never came down from Moscow to quash new debates or censor certain points of view. By the start of 1989, glasnost had essentially led to a culture of full freedom of speech, similar to the rights to expression enjoyed in Western countries. Glasnost meant an end to censorship of dissident writers and artists, and allowing an opening up of criticisms of Soviet history once again. We had seen a similar, more limited phenomenon before, with Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalin and the so-called thaw that followed. But the generation of the 1950s and 60s who experienced the thaw, Mikhail Gorbachev's generation, was fundamentally different from the generation of the 80s and 90s, which was now exposed once again to a widespread denunciation of the Soviet Union's past leadership. The difference was that in the 1950s, while many people were ready to reject Stalin as an aberration and saw his denunciation as a reinvigorating of socialism, of bringing the USSR back to its Leninist roots, the younger generation, now able to examine Soviet history free of censorship, came to different conclusions. Historians and political commentators published works in the USSR for the first time, pointing out that the totalitarianism of Stalin was enabled by the authoritarianism of Lenin and the Bolsheviks in the 1920s. They concluded that the supposed noble democratic Leninist project was not bastardized by Stalin, but perfected by him, and that the repressions of Stalin were a natural outgrowth of Leninism. Therefore, a large segment of the educated population of the USSR, rather than seeking to reinvigorate socialism with new democratic values, began to reject it outright. But if there had never actually been any Leninist golden age, then there could be nothing to return to reinvigorate the Soviet project. That project must therefore, in their eyes, be rejected in some form or another. Some drifted towards social democracy or so-called democratic socialism, while others began to advocate for Western-style liberal democracy. More than either of these two, however, people drifted towards various ideologies of nationalism. Nationalism in this context basically means the idea that the legitimate expression of sovereignty lay not necessarily with the mass of the people or with any particular ideology, but is rather tied to the idea of a nation-state. That people of the same or similar backgrounds, speaking the same language and sharing the same history, should rule themselves for the benefit of that nation. I will say more about what some of those specific ideologies were in the Soviet Union in a later episode. For the time being, nationalist aspirations, even within the context of glasnost, remained rather modest within the Soviet Union. In 1987 and 1988, only the most radical nationalists actually spoke openly about breaking away from the Soviet Union entirely. The various peoples of the USSR had been bound together for so long and become so economically interdependent that the idea of full national independence was still unthinkable to most, with the possible exception of the Baltic republics of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, which are perhaps a special case, and we will hear more about them in an upcoming episode. If things had remained relatively stable, perhaps Gorbachev would have succeeded in his effort to remake the Soviet Union as a more liberal social democracy. But events outside the USSR were once again poised to swoop in and further destabilize it. The winds of revolutionary change were brewing in the Eastern Bloc nations of Eastern Europe, and when that storm made landfall, the series of events it set in motion would test the durability of Perestroika and of the Soviet Union itself. The revolutions of 1989 in Eastern Europe mark the start of the endgame for the USSR, and I will begin my examination of those events in the next episode. That's everything for today. Thank you so much for listening. As always, a special thank you to my patrons who support the show with monthly donations on Patreon. Unfortunately, starting on January 1st, you will only be able to support the show on Patreon and will no longer be able to provide financial support through Spotify. So if you like what you heard and you want to support the show, head on over to patreon.com/historyspherepodcast. That link is also available on the show's website at www.thehistorysphere.com. Also on that website, you will find links to all of my streaming platforms, social media, and a list of my sources for this week's episode. That website again is www.thehistorysphere.com. Though you can no longer donate to the show through Spotify, if you're listening on Spotify, you can leave a comment directly on the episode. Ask a question, correct a mistake, or just let me know what you thought of the episode. More engagement helps to promote the show in the algorithm and introduce us to new listeners, so it really does help me out quite a bit. Next time, on the History Sphere, my focus will shift to Eastern Europe as I begin a multi-episode examination of the Eastern Bloc revolutions of 1989 that brought an end to the Cold War and plunged the Soviet Union into its final phase of decline. Thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful day.